Hey there guys, and welcome to this episode of Gearus TV. Today we're going to be breaking down the Fresh Foam 980 Trail from New Balance. Now if you're a subscriber to Gearus on YouTube, which if you're not, you should be, then you may remember that earlier this year we took a look at the Fresh Foam 980 Road right here, and you can also see that video by clicking BAM! Right there and check out that review. Now while I did have a couple niggles here and there with a little bit of the shape in the forefoot and things like that, overall I thought it was a really well built, well put together, and well constructed shoe. One of the biggest challenges for me with that shoe was the messaging by way of its marketing. Now in the messaging it kind of made it sound like it was a super soft shoe, and so when I got it, it wasn't so soft. And there are a lot of people that felt this way, a lot of reviewers, friends of mine, and it was a very interesting call on New Balance's part. So I reached out to New Balance and we actually had a little bit of a chat about it, and this is what they said. This shoe is definitely not to be considered a maximalist, fatty shoe. This is an extremely lightweight, neutral, low to the ground running shoe. By the name and tagline, people are assuming it's a super large midsole shoe, but it is not. In creating the shoe, we took the learnings we had from 3D printing and our successful minimalist collection. It is great that they clarified that for me, and I totally agree that what the person said in the email really does clarify it and does describe the shoe a little bit better. But the messaging is still a little bit off. I mean, they call it the science of soft and things like that. But that's okay, that's okay. So I was curious to see what it would be like going into the 980 Road Trail, to see what the messaging had to do, if they'd made some changes to the things that myself and some other reviewers had said earlier in the year as regards to that shoe. And so it'll be very interesting to take a look at. So let's start breaking it down. While generally we don't really do very many comparative reviews, there's going to be a lot of parallels with this because, again, there is a 980 Fresh Foam 980 Trail and a Fresh Foam 980 Road. So you will hear me comparing back and forth a little bit. Now, I would suggest that if you've not seen our review, the video review again, of the 980 Road, I would suggest taking a look at that, or you can also click here and take a look at the written review of the 980 Road as well. That will give you kind of a better perspective on where we're coming from with the 980 Road. So let's get into talking about the outsole. First, much like the 980 Road, the hexagon plays a big role in the 980 Trail. As you can see here, the outsole is made of a single sheet of blown rubber, and the way that the tread pattern works on this is that these are kind of elongated hexagons. They're not exactly like really even hexagons or anything like that. They're kind of stretched out. And what this does is that it allows in the front half of the shoe, so from the midfoot forward, you can kind of see the transition right about there. From the front half of the shoe forward, that is all with the raised edges. The back sides of the hexagons are raised to provide traction for ascending or going uphill. Now in the back half of the shoe, as you can see, it's the opposite of that. So where the leading edges of those hexagons are raised, again, to provide braking force as you're going downhill or something like that. I'll hold it up to the camera a little bit, maybe give you a little bit of perspective if the camera decides to focus. So very interesting there, the way they've chosen to do that. Now in the Fresh Foam 980 Road, I commented how despite its lack of flex screws, the shoe really maintained a pretty decent amount of flexibility, and it was pretty impressive. And that carries over fully into the Fresh Foam 980 Trail. As you can see here, you can even bend it back far into the heel. This is quite a flexible shoe. It bends and gives with the foot, which is great for when your foot needs to adapt to different kinds of terrain when you're running on a trail. Another thing is that, as you can see here, the outsole is very uniform in its height. It's not particularly spiky lugs or anything like this, or cleats almost. In this case, it's very uniform. Now what this makes for is an actually pretty decent road ride, actually a really good road ride, which is great because, again, a lot of people, rather than having the Fresh Foam 980 Road and the Fresh Foam 980 Trail, whether it's because of money or just because they don't want to have another shoe laying around, they decide to go with one shoe or another. And if you're somebody who's going to run to a trailhead on a little bit of road, this is going to be pretty good shoe for that. I mean, again, I've tried this on the road and it does a really solid job. Actually, a very similar ride to the Fresh Foam 980 Road. I can't really comment to the durability of the lugs, but I will say that, again, because they don't stick out very far and they're pretty flat, as you can see there, there are no real sharp edges sticking this way, up or down, as it were, that it should be fairly durable for road. But again, not a road shoe, this is a trail shoe. However, the ride on the road is very, very nice, and the outsole complements that quite well. Now, the traction of the outsole on the Fresh Foam 980 Trail is an interesting thing. As you can see, again, as I mentioned earlier, the lugs are not particularly spiky. They're not cleat-like or anything like that. The first thing I'll say that is on single track and well-groomed trail, this thing rips. It is fantastic for that. The ride is spectacular. We're going to talk about the ride in the ride section here in a few minutes, but it does a really great job and is really, really well suited to those trails. Even stuff that's kind of off trail through fields and things like that does a really, really fantastic job. When descending, even on pretty technical terrain, I found for me that this did a great job. Despite it's not a huge stack height, it's actually fairly traditional in stack height, but despite that, it still felt really solid underfoot, and I didn't feel myself feeling like I was going to roll over or not able to stick to things. What was interesting is that when ascending, when going uphill, particularly when the terrain got a little looser, whether it was pebbles or sand or a little kind of rocky, what I found was that I had to be conscious. It wasn't like it was a loose traction or something like that, but I did have to be conscious that I was really keeping my foot under my body and not leaning into the hill too much. Because a couple times when I did find myself really leaning into the hill to kind of dig up, I slipped a little bit. Now, I didn't slip as in I slipped and fell down a hill, but I would feel my foot slide back this much. Not a big deal, and if you keep your foot solidly underneath you, it's going to account for that. But this is something that I noticed, and again, it's probably because, again, there's a very uniform height and shape to the lug, and they're not particularly technical. But a really great shoe for that mixed terrain. I mean, on technical terrain, again, because it's not got super long lugs, it's going to have a hard time with some of that stuff. But I can totally see this being an ultra-marathon shoe because it's got a pretty good deal. Again, not a soft shoe, which we'll talk about in the midsole section, but it's got great traction for the long-haul events like that. So I would look out for this coming in the ultra season pretty soon here. Now let's talk about the midsole of the Fresh Foam 980 Trail, and this is where we're going to do a lot of comparison because the midsole is where this shoe comes alive. Again, it's called the Fresh Foam, and this is where the majority of that foam takes place, this single density EVA right here. Now, rather than relying on different densities of EVA throughout the shoe, if they're postings and all this kind of things that traditional shoes might use, what New Balance has done here, as they did with the Fresh Foam 980 Road, is they have taken convex and concave hexagons all down the sides of the shoe in different places to account for either more firmness or a little less firmness to keep the shoe and the foot kind of functioning the way that they want it to. Now, as you can see on the medial side of the shoe, and I'm going to hold them kind of like this so you guys can get a feel for it, on the medial side of the shoe, it's basically the same. On the rear of the shoe, you can see here they're convex, okay, convex hexagons up to right about there. And again, here on the trail shoe, while the hexagons are a little bit bigger, they're convex up to right about the same spot. And then, as with the road, they become concave up toward the front. This is on the medial side of the inside of the foot. They become concave toward the forefoot. That continues around the back. It's the same, okay, a little bit the same. This transitions to being concave right about here, whereas on this one it transitions kind of just on the lateral side of the middle of the heel. So interesting little thing to note there. Then again, both here on the lateral side, this, where the road is concave about halfway up, it then becomes convex in the front half of the shoe. What's interesting is on the trail, it is concave. It is concave full length of the lateral side of the shoe. Now, while I did not reach out to New Balance to ask why this is, I can say that for me, it feels like it's something that's not really trying to kind of push you onto that medial side of the foot. It's not trying to guide your foot too much. I really like this a lot better because I feel like it balances out. The forefoot is where the majority of the action in my particular stride happens, and I feel like having them balanced with convex hexagons on the medial side and on the lateral side really allows for a much more even ride. So I really like this. Again, not a lot going on. Very simple. It is single density EVA, but it does a great job of really balancing out that foot very well. While I did feel that it contradicted the marketing a little bit, I did feel like the firmness in the sole of the Fresh Foam 980 Road was actually really nice and gave the shoe a lot of pep and a lot of response, which is not what you would expect from a shoe that looks and generally feels like that. It's the same in the Fresh Foam 980 Trail. The midsole of the shoe has a firmness. It's very, very similar to the Fresh Foam 980 Road and does a great job. It makes it actually also able to not have to have the additional weight of a rock plate. There is no rock plate in this, and you do feel a little bit of push through, but you're going to feel push through even with a rock plate. But even on pretty rocky stuff, I didn't feel anything that was uncomfortable, and I was on some really very rocky stuff. So don't worry about the lack of a rock plate in this. It adds to flexibility not having it there, and it is able to cut weight because this is a kind of weighty shoe, which we're going to talk about in a second anyway. And for you spec heads out there like myself, the drop on this shoe, as with the Fresh Foam 980 Road, is 4 millimeters. Now let's get into talking about the upper of the Fresh Foam 980 Trail. As you can see here, it is a complete departure from the Road version of this shoe. And that's a good thing because this, while very comfortable, I actually really liked this upper a lot. This needs to be a little more beefy, a little heavier, and more adapted to trail. So it does a nice job of that. Now the first thing that I would point out is that this is a single piece of mesh. You can see there are a bunch of overlays and everything, but there's a stitch here, and that's the only stitch on the upper, which is really nice. This is a tightly woven air mesh, which is meant to provide lightweight breathability without being overly rigid or anything like that. And while it is more rigid than the Road version, for good reason, it's still very supple and does a nice job on the foot. It's also finely packed enough to keep out fine debris. Now, even more tightly packed is the mesh on the inside, which it's difficult to see on the camera like that, but the mesh on the inside is actually very comfortable with a barefoot. I tend to run with socks 99% of the time. I tell you guys that all the time, but with this shoe, I always try to But I do always try to run at least one time in a shoe without socks because a lot of people choose to do that. And this does a great job. I didn't have any problems with chafing or hot spots or anything like that. I do tend to run in shoes with socks on, but this did a nice job because the internal mesh is nice and finely packed. It actually breathes really well too. Sometimes you find with trail shoes, with tightly woven shoes, that weave, while it does a great job of keeping things out, it also keeps heat in and it becomes a little swampy. So that did not occur with this. I felt very comfortable. Now the overlays on this shoe, the support elements, they are all welded overlays, bonded overlays, and synthetic materials. Now what's interesting about this is that in most shoes you're going to see the top part of the supports connect all the way down to this area, which is this, in this case, Strobel construction. It'll attach to the Strobel board area for support. But what they've chosen to do in this shoe is very interesting, and there's something that came out of this that I'll talk about in a minute. But what you can see is that none of the top support elements really connect to the bottom. Now, they use the mesh here because the mesh is durable enough, as well as interior support structure, to provide that support structure of the shoe, but it also adds flexibility to that upper and allows the shoe to move and give and everything kind of like that, which is a really interesting concept and actually pretty well executed in this shoe. The tongue on the Fresh Foam 980 Trail is gusseted about 2/3 the way up. You can kind of see it right there, and it's got double lace guides right here, which is nice because it not only keeps the tongue in place, but just kind of keeps everything in control on the top of the foot. So that's actually a really nice feature that I enjoy. The heel counter on this shoe is actually one of my favorite kind of design elements, and I rarely talk about design elements, but I really like the way that this looks. It's kind of like that mesh, wide bore mesh with overlaid kind of TPU film or something like that. It's a really nice, pretty traditional heel counter. It does come up about 3/4 the way of the shoe, but it's pretty traditional and forms a really nice heel cup on this. Now, a really nice part of this upper is that it drains very well in my experience. I only took it through some water once, about ankle deep, but it drained really well because you can see that the mesh comes fully down to the Strobel board, to the midsole, both on the medial and lateral side, so it's going to let that water out of there. Now, I mentioned last week when we took a look at the Saucony Type A6 racing flat that there were drain holes on the bottom, and I don't really see the point for drain holes because even in a shoe like this, again, I took this through water, there are no bottom side drain holes, and it drained really well. Bottom side drain holes simply don't do anything. So in this shoe, they did a great job by keeping them out of the way because it might compromise the structure of the midsole and the outsole, but rather they just pulled the mesh all the way down to the bottom here, and it does a great job of draining and keeping dry inside. Now, the one thing that I do want to point out on the upper of this shoe is a little thing that has to do with the fact that, again, there's bonded support elements down here on the bottom and bonded support elements here on the top, and how they interact. Now, as you can see right here on the lateral forefoot and on the medial forefoot, but we're going to concentrate on lateral forefoot right now, is that this little piece of bonding here, that's right where a flex groove happens. And what you can see, or rather where the foot flexes, what you can see is that with this bottom piece coming up, interacting with this top piece, there's actually almost like a sawing action right in there. Now, I've got about 40 miles on this shoe, and I think the mesh is holding up really well. However, I do want to point out that that slight little bit right there has picked the fabric a little bit. It's not tearing. I'm not saying it's tearing, and I think this will more than hold up the life of the shoe, unless you, of course, rake it across, like, you know, a rock or something. But it is creating a sawing action. I think that is definitely something that should be improved upon or looked at or kind of rehashed in a version 2 of the shoe. Again, I think the mesh will hold up fantastic. Again, 40 miles on this. The durability is still quite good. That little area just kind of bugs me because I tend to not push off a ton. I don't toe off a ton. But if you are somebody whose foot ends up like this a lot and is really kind of digging down on those areas, it's going to saw a little bit, and you might see some results of that. But again, I don't think it's a deal breaker, and surely New Balance, if you wind up with something like that, would be able to talk to you about it, or, you know, at least maybe they'll address it in version 2.0. Here's hoping. In the Fresh Foam 980 Road, one of the things that I talked about kind of bugged me was the amount of foam in the tongue and the collar area. It's quite puffy. There's just a lot of unnecessary material there. I think it could be slimmed down. It's not super heavy or anything. I don't see where it's necessary. Now, in the 980 Trail, they've done a good job of slimming that down. First, we'll start with the tongue. As you can see here, much thinner. It's actually kind of a single density tongue all the way. It's not a super fine mesh, but it is a mesh overlaying a little bit of foam that's actually got cuts in it to be even more breathable. So that's a really nice addition and a really big and nice change from the 980 Road. Now, here in the collar, it's actually kind of about the same amount of foam, but the way that the upper and the kind of interior, the sock liner, not the sock liner, but the collar material is adapted and attached to that collar foam, it makes it more compact, less puffy, and actually gives it a better, kind of a denser, more tough feel. So I really, really like that a lot. In the Fresh Foam 980 Road, I commented that I felt like my sizing fell into a crack. I felt comfortable in the size 11, which is what I typically wear, but I also felt like I probably could have pushed an 11.5 if I needed to. And what I said at that time, and I still stand by this, is that even in the 980 Trail or the 980 Road, I would recommend going to your local run shop and getting fit by somebody who knows what they're looking at, knows what they're doing, and is going to be able to count for your foot shape and size. Now, in the Trail, part of the reason that I felt in the Road that it was maybe a little bit small for me is the pointiness of the toe. And what's great is that they have addressed that in the Trail. But before we get into that, let's talk about kind of start at the rear of the foot and move forward. Starting at the heel of the shoe, I feel like the compacted foam here and in the tongue actually makes for a more comfortable fit. You don't kind of feel that unnecessary puffiness, and I don't want to say bulk because in the 980 Road it's not bulk, it's just kind of there and you kind of wonder why. But in this, it really feel like allows your foot to sink back into that heel cup and really feel very secure. As you move forward into the midfoot, I do think that the laces have a great amount of room. This is going to account for high volume or low volume foot because there's good amount of play in the throat here, so you can cinch down if your foot is lower volume, but there's also plenty of play even with the gussets if you've got a higher volume foot. And if I'm not mistaken, this does also come in multiple widths. Now let's move on to the forefoot of the shoe. Now in the Fresh Foam 980 Road, I commented that the forefoot area, the metatarsal area right about here, was okay. It was a little bit kind of touching the sides of my foot more than I would want to, but it was okay. The problem that I had was the pointiness of the toe, and I didn't understand it then, and I still don't understand it now. But one of the things is, and this kind of seems to be a thing with some New Balance shoes, is that they've got this great shoe going on, and then they get to the toe, and they're like, oh, let's just slap a pointy toe on there. So it's going to be interesting because there's some things coming down the pipeline from New Balance that I think are going to try to address this. And they actually, in the 980 Trail, began to address this a little bit, which is really, really great improvement over the 980 Road. Now, as you can see here, here's the 980 Road that I'll hold up. You can see that there's a little bit more roundness. Particularly, it still comes to this point right here, okay? That didn't change much. But you can see that here on the lateral side of the toes, right? There is more room. And it feels like there's more room. Not a ton more room, and there could not a ton more room, and there could certainly stand to be more. But as it stands, this is a very nice improvement over this shoe. So really good, whether it's coming from their design and everybody kind of getting their heads together at New Balance, or it comes from listening to reviewers and runners at large, that's a really great improvement. So way to pay attention to that New Balance. Now let's briefly touch on the ride. We've been kind of touching on the ride throughout this review, but we're going to talk a little bit more concentratedly about it here. As I mentioned earlier, this shoe loves single track. I mean, when you get this on well-groomed trail, this thing just does so well and it feels so fantastic. And that's why I think for people that are looking to have a single shoe to go from some road to some trail, this is going to be the type of trail that they're running on, and this is going to be a good shoe for that. As I mentioned earlier, I was curious to see that with its kind of more traditional stack height, how this was going to handle on more technical trail, and it actually did a really good job. Again, I didn't feel rolly or anything like that. I just felt nice and stable on the trail, which is really, really good, seeing that this is a little bit higher than something I'm usually used to running in on trails. While this is certainly not the lightest trail shoe you're going to come across, it's 10.3 ounces at a men's size 9, so this is size 11, heavier than that. It's not the lightest, but it doesn't feel heavy. You know, I didn't feel like clumpy or anything like that. It's kind of there, and you know, it just feels like a shoe. It doesn't feel heavy. So don't worry and don't let the numbers and the statistics of the weight deceive you. Put it on your foot, go for a run on trail, and then make that call. Overall, I really feel like this shoe is a great option for somebody who's looking for a more traditional shoe construction and shoe shape, but in a lower geometry shoe, a lower drop with 4 millimeters of drop. It's also a good option for somebody who's going to go from road to trail. This is a great shoe for that. While it is a trail shoe, not a hybrid shoe, I feel like its outsole and its ride really lend itself to that. Now, if you are somebody who wants to have two pairs of shoes, why not have two pairs of shoes that literally are the same? They're just a road version and a trail version. So I really think that that's something that's going to be appealing to somebody, to be able to just slap on a shoe, not have to worry about a world of differences, and be able to know what kind of ride they're getting. The improvements made over the Fresh Foam 980 Road aren't and didn't really need to be these massive, huge sea changes to the shoe, but they did a nice job with the subtle things that they did. While I think there's still room for improvement on the shoe, I think that everything that they've done is a really wise step in the right direction. I can't wait to see what version 2.0 looks like. The Fresh Foam 980 Trail is going to be available from New Balance starting in July of 2014. Before we get into the ratings, our question for you guys is, have you tried any of the Fresh Foam shoes? And if you have, what do you think? Now let's get into the ratings. For construction, 4.5 stars. This is New Balance, high quality, really well built shoe. Next up, for durability, we're going to give it 4 stars. It would be higher actually, but this little thing right here is kind of For comfort, 4 stars. It's a comfortable shoe. Fit, 3.5 stars. It still might fall into the crack of sizing for some people, and the toe box could stand just a little bit more room. Weight, also 3.5 stars. It is a little heavy. It's typical for a trail shoe, but more and more trail shoes are starting to come lighter and lighter, so I think this could take a nudge from that direction. And finally, performance, 4 stars. Guys, thanks so much for watching this episode of Gearist TV. Please don't forget to like and favorite this video. If you've got any questions or comments about the video, leave it in the comments section right down there. We'd be happy to answer it. Also, find us on all the social networks. Facebook.com/Gearist, Instagram @TheGearist, Twitter @TheGearist, Google+, just search for Gearist, and also here on YouTube, YouTube.com/TheGearist. And by the way, if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, you should be. Also, check out all of our written reviews over at Gearist.com and let us know what you think. We've got a comment section there too, and we'd love to hear from you guys. If you've got something that you'd like to see specifically reviewed, let us know about it. We'll see if we can't get it in-house. If you'd like to send us an email, you can do that by emailing info@Gearist.com. Thank you guys again, and we'll see you next time.